Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's always a pleasure to be here, of course. And I appreciate also the honor of being invited to participate in the events that the museum is organizing this year, dedicated to Saint Joseph. And also to speak about a person so important and so associated with Christ and yet so little known. A person that is a man worth knowing. My working assumption is that Joseph of Nazareth is a man worth knowing. This actually flies in the face of traditional majority opinion. Almost all biblical theologians agree that so scarce is the canonical literature about him, that the Bible itself considers Joseph of Nazareth as a figure of no real consequence. Moreover, notwithstanding this want of information and knowledge about him, so much has been done in mainstream Christianity to sideline him, to downgrade him. And given also that so late in Catholic history has he been called to the altars, it should be safe to assume that there is in fact no real reason why anyone should bother too much about what both the Orthodox and Protestantism consider a minor biblical figure. In almost 1,800 years of history of Christianity, without Saint Joseph should have buried him for good. On the other hand, in what I would consider a peak in modern and in the rapid renaissance of this minor biblical figure last year, Pope Francis proclaimed December 2020 to December 2021 as a year to be dedicated to him. While the current Pope's initiative went against the grain of over 15 centuries of church neglect, 15 centuries during which Joseph of Nazareth was barely venerated anywhere and at all, it falls squarely in line with the modern Pope's take on the saint. This take, this new approach to Joseph of Nazareth, commenced in 1870 when Pope Pius IX, in the context of the First Vatican Council that he had convoked, proclaimed him patron of the Universal Church. Prior to Pius IX, who was the longest reigning Pope, who headed the Church for 32 years, Saint Joseph was known and venerated, but barely so. It had been only in 1480, almost 1,500 years into church history, that the first official approval of a liturgical commemoration of Saint Joseph came about. It was a late medieval Pope, Sixtus IV, notable for the construction of the Sistine Chapel, who 2 years after his election issued a written consent addressed to the Franciscan Order from which he hailed for the holding of an annual feast of Saint Joseph on March 19th, the day believed since the Middle Ages to be the day of his death, of his the day which was his dies natalis, that is meaning his birth unto heaven. Falling a few days before the 25th of March, the day of the Annunciation, its symbolic message that Joseph had nothing to do with the Incarnation seems almost inescapable. The Franciscan Order, following closely on St. Francis of Assisi's fascination with the humanity of Jesus, had not only conserved their founder's idea of setting up Christmas cribs to illustrate it. St. Francis as you all know, had created the first nativity scene at Gozo a few years before his death. But also gradually over more than a century, they popularized the tradition and drew from it, from the tradition of cribs, of Christmas cribs, a theology of the humanity of Jesus. Such a theology on the humanity of Jesus, which is another name for the theology of the Incarnation, could not ignore Mary, of course, nor could it ignore Joseph alongside her, and neither could it ignore the years of the infancy of Jesus. The root of this development, as I said, was the first nativity scene that their founder, St. Francis of Assisi, had made at Gozo 2 years before his death in 1226. Nevertheless, the script consisted only of a child representing baby Jesus and some live animals. No Mary and no Joseph. These two biblical figures only start to be added later. Mary for her direct role in the Incarnation as the mother of the divine child, and Joseph as the holy witness to it. It would take many years for this theology of the humanity of Jesus to take form. It would take almost 150 years from the crib of Gozo to arrive to the decree of 1480 by which Sixtus IV officialized the Franciscan Order's devotion to Saint Joseph. And it would take almost another century and a half, for this decree to be extended to the Universal Church. This was done by Pope Gregory XV in 1621. 1621, we have the first official commemoration of Saint Joseph on the 19th of March. This is not to say that during the almost 1,500 years of semi-obscurity, Joseph of Nazareth was entirely unknown, or that there was no local, sparse and isolated commemorations of him. He was always there in the infancy stories of Matthew and Luke, but these stories were rarely read in the vernacular. But stories about him during the Middle Ages abounded, and mystery plays that drew as many curiosities as possible from the Apocrypha. Their popularization by Jacobus de Voragine's 1298 book, The Golden Legenda Aurea, also helped in a limited way. But St. Joseph enjoyed no independent cult. De Voragine, who wrote about the saints according to their memorial in the Roman calendar, mentions Joseph of Nazareth only in the narratives of Jesus and of the Virgin Mary, since he did not yet have a feast day of his own. The Golden Legend considers only the saints that then featured in the Roman calendar, and in this calendar, Saint Joseph did not appear until 1621. Fast track to 1870, when Saint Joseph's proclamation as patron of the Church happened, and there we have the start of a rapid growth towards the importance that the Catholic Church has been giving to Saint Joseph, to Joseph of Nazareth, in modern times. An importance and a veneration that had and still has no parallel in Orthodoxy, let alone Reformation Christianity. As regards the Orthodox Church, Joseph of Nazareth is a minor figure in the plethora of biblical figures. Orthodoxy, in general, gives him no particular cult, nor a feast day of his own, up to this day. Their liturgy refers to him as the holy and righteous Joseph the betrothed, and he is commemorated together with St. James, the brother of the Lord, and together with David the king on the first Sunday after the feast of the Nativity, or on the 26th December, if there is no Sunday between December 25 and January 1. Just to give you an idea of the burgeoning of Joseph of Nazareth's Catholic reputation in the modern era, just consider the rapid succession of popes promoting his cult since his proclamation as patron of the Universal Church in 1870, just after Pope Pius IX, who proclaimed Joseph patron of the Church. Leo XIII issued a very important encyclical on Saint Joseph of Nazareth. He issued actually a trailblazing document about Saint Joseph in 1889. Pope Benedict XV instituted the feast of the Holy Family of Jesus, Mary, and Joseph in 1921, thereby adding another calendar insert in Saint Joseph's honor, alongside that of March the 19th. In 1955, Pius XII created yet another feast, that of May the 1st, in honor of Saint Joseph the Worker. Thus, 3 calendar commemorations, not bad for a saint who had none for 15 centuries. The most recent promotions that Saint Joseph received are those of 1962, when Pope John XXIII inserted his name in the Roman Canon, the various teachings of Paul VI and John Paul II, and immediately after his election in 2013, Pope Francis's addition of Saint Joseph's name to all the standard Eucharistic prayers in the Catholic Church. The point I wish to make here is this: how did it obtain that Joseph of Nazareth, supposedly a minor figure with a marginal role in the Jesus biblical narrative, actively set aside during the first centuries to shield Jesus from Docetism and Arianism, namely that the Son of God, that Jesus was not really the Son of God, but only an adopted Son of God, and that the Son of God had not really become a man, but only apparently man. That is, a biblical figure neglected for hundreds of years because of this. How did he achieve such prominence in a very late development of his cult? How did it come about that Joseph, some 1,700 years after his death, become a man worth discovering, worth knowing, and worth celebrating? I believe that this happened through the gradual emergence of an undercurrent of admiration that rose to the surface through the combination of, 1, the development of biblical research, spearheaded by the Enlightenment; 2, the 19th century rediscovery of the Apocrypha; and 3, the demands of a changing culture that sought to grasp the historical present by reviewing and reinterpreting the past, something that was happening also in the Catholic Church. These 3 dynamics influenced the Catholic Church, not only from the outside, but also in its internal life, opening her up to exciting responses to modernity. It is within this context that the relevance of Joseph of Nazareth started to be felt in the right places, that is, in Rome. And as a consequence, he started to be, so to speak, unearthed. He started to be dug up. He started to be rediscovered. A discovery that led to a proliferation of this cult, a phenomenon peculiar solely to the Catholic Church, because I said orthodoxy, static as regards St. Joseph, and Reformation, Christianity cannot allow for any cult of any saint. I see in this rediscovery the appearance of 3 Josephs, 3 dimensions to Joseph of Nazareth: the biblical, the apocryphal, and the contemporary. Should I point out here that I am distinguishing between these 3 aspects of St. Joseph, the biblical, the apocryphal, and the contemporary, for reasons of methodology and clarity. They are intertwined. They nourish one another and question each other. The biblical and the apocryphal aspects of St. Joseph are closely linked, with the latter, the apocryphal that is, seeking to beef up the former, the biblical, and together, the biblical and the apocryphal germinating that contemporary take on the saint. whose identity remains nevertheless in flux, and taking on whatever more exciting facets in all the areas of scholarship, spirituality, and art. Starting with the biblical Joseph. There are several people named Joseph in the Bible. He is, of course, the son of the patriarch Jacob and his wife Rachel, the one that his brothers sold into Egyptian slavery, and then rose to the summit of pharaonic power, which served him to save his family from a devastating famine and possible death. In the New Testament, the better known over and against Joseph of Arimathea, who is mentioned in connection with the burial of Christ, is of course Joseph of Nazareth, whose name appears in Matthew, Luke, and John, but not at all in Mark, and not at all in the rest of the New Testament books. I could very well refer to Joseph of Nazareth as a New Testament rather than a biblical figure. The reason why biblical is preferable is that scholars, following closely on Matthew and Luke, put Joseph of Nazareth in wider perspective than just that of the New Testament. They perceive, as we shall immediately see, several parallels between the narrative of Joseph of Genesis, Joseph of the book of Genesis, and that of the Gospels. They also see these parallels as reciprocally revealing. In fact, it seems that the narrative of the New Testament Joseph is not entirely devoid of elements deriving from the story of the Old Testament Joseph. It should not be considered surprising, since what the New Testament gives is, of course, history, but it is a history related through the theological perspective of depicting Jesus as the Messiah. Let me mention only three parallels between the Joseph of the Old Testament and the Joseph of the New. Both of them are said to have a Jacob as their respective father. The father of the OT Joseph was Jacob, married to his mother Rachel, and Matthew's genealogy of Joseph concludes with Jacob, the father of Joseph, the betrothed of Mary, of whom Christ was born. A second parallel is that both of them are royalty. The Old Testament Joseph preceded King David in a line of succession towards the promised Messiah, while Joseph of Nazareth's birth scales the same lineage up to King David, thereby vindicating the appellation of Jesus as Son of David. This lineage was essential for the Jews to accept Jesus' claim to be the promised Messiah. Another parallel, the third one, is that both the first Old Testament Joseph and our Joseph had to put up with immense difficulties in order to carry out their role in salvation history, one of which was exile into Egypt. Matthew is keen to draw this out of the hidden life of Jesus, so that with reference to the infant Jesus' return from Egyptian exile and in support of his messianic claims, he could quote the prophet Hosea, "Out of Egypt have I called my son." By my son, Hosea means Israel, Jacob, whose bones the Jews carried back to the promised land at the Exodus. By my son, of course, Matthew means Jesus. There are other parallels between the two biblical Josephs. I cannot fail to mention the role of dreams, an apparently exotic quality in the life of both, but otherwise a quite ordinary means in biblical narratives of God's communication with his chosen ones. Both the Old and the New Testament Josephs knew spiritual torment. At this time, both struggled to know how to conduct themselves according to God's will, and both are said to have received divine instructions in dreams. And indeed, both acted upon them without objection and in absolute obedience. In the case of Joseph of Nazareth, this obedience goes to the extremity of not having on record a single word uttered by him. Joseph of Nazareth is the silent one, the silent witness in the Jesus narrative. There in this silence we have the most celebrated element of his biblical biography. Mary, his fiancée, John the Baptist, Zachariah and Elizabeth, Mary Magdalene, Martha, and Mary of Bethany, and a host of other contemporaries of Jesus, including apostles, friends, and enemies, all speak, and thereby all give information about Jesus and themselves. But not Joseph, not the one amongst them all, with the exception of Mary, about whom, for the mysteries that he holds, we would be most curious to know more, if not for theological reasons, at least for the secrets of his romance. Joseph's silence is, of course, a theological silence. He could speak, but he wouldn't. Indeed, it is probable that he spoke several languages: Aramaic most of the time, the language which most of his contemporaries in Judea and Galilee would have spoken as their native tongue, but also Hebrew, the language of scripture, of the liturgy in the temple, and language of Jerusalem, which we are told by Luke Joseph visited regularly with his family. Being a carpenter, in Greek teknon, a trade that included carpentry as well as construction, Joseph might well have known some Greek and Latin too, languages that would have allowed him to conduct his trade and interact with the people living along the shores of Galilee, many of them Greek and Latin-speaking Gentiles. Jesus, his son, who took up the same trade as his father, seems to have known all these four languages. Nevertheless, notwithstanding the languages that he may have spoken, Joseph is not reported by the canonical New Testament to have pronounced a single word. This is the result of a theological choice made by the authors of the New Testament. This choice calls for a theologically adequate interpretation, of course, but for the purposes of this paper, it appears to have a link with the meagerness of information we have about him. Indeed, everybody says so, so it must be true. But is it true? I believe that the Bible tells us about Joseph what we need to know. Not everybody agrees with me here. The authors of the Apocrypha certainly do not. But more about that later. So what does the Bible tell us about Joseph of Nazareth? I'm not going to repeat what I have written in this book. So the small article I wrote should be complementary to what I am saying here. So I will be very brief. Let me take up briefly the two Gospel books, respectively, according to Mark and John. Both are quite mean regarding information about Joseph of Nazareth. Both disregard the birth and the infancy of Jesus. The earliest of the two, the Gospel according to Mark, does not mention Joseph by name at all, although he indirectly refers to him where, in identifying Jesus, he repeatedly refers to Jesus as hailing from Nazareth. He also mentions Jesus' trade as that of teknon, or as we say today, carpenter. But teknon is not just a carpenter, but a builder, a construction of houses, somebody who not only constructs houses with stone and wood, but also provides for the apertures and so on, and for the furniture as well. He also on the supposition that according to Semitic custom, Jesus would have learned his trade from his father, and that Jesus would have been raised in his father's town and village. We have here in Mark 2 tiny and early bits of information about Joseph. Mark's Gospel is dated in the mid to 60s, to the late 60s, from the birth of Christ, of the Christian era. What about John? John, the last of the four Gospels to be composed around the year 100 Anno Domini, is concerned exclusively with the divine origin of Jesus. At the time of writing, the debate about whether the man Jesus was really divine was already raging in Asia Minor. Gnosticism declaimed that Jesus was no more than the son of Mary and Joseph, and was therefore inferior to God, had already raised its head. So John would have been reluctant to refer to Joseph at all. The primary purpose of John's Gospel was to affirm that Jesus is indeed the pre-existent Word, the Son of God. Nevertheless, John does mention Joseph, but in a pretty negative angle. To the Apostle Philip's claim that Jesus of Nazareth, the son of Joseph, was the one of whom Moses in the law and also the prophets wrote, his addressee, Bartholomew, replied, "Can anything good come out of Nazareth?" And in the same negative perspective, John reports on Nazareth and Joseph as serious barriers to the acceptance of Jesus as the Messiah. With some sarcasm, after hearing his teachings about him being the bread of life, the crowd said, "Is this not Jesus, the son of Mary, whose father and mother we know?" And with skepticism, "Is the Christ to come from Galilee?" Here in John, we have perhaps the earliest written case of the official ostracism that Joseph of Nazareth will suffer for the next millennium and a half. What about Matthew and Luke? These two evangelists are more generous, both as regards the amount of information that they give about Joseph of Nazareth and the sympathy with which they give it. None of the rest of the New Testament books refer to him at all. So, we owe it to Matthew and Luke that we have the information that we have about Joseph. Nevertheless, what they tell us is strictly subordinate to their theological objective, the affirmation of Jesus as the fulfillment of biblical prophecy, and this fulfillment beyond expectation. Jesus is the Messiah. Jesus, however, is not merely the Messiah announced by the prophets, but indeed he is the Emmanuel himself, God himself amongst us. Joseph is no protagonist in Matthew and Luke. He is what filmmakers would call a supporting actor, a supporting character. He is there to support from the sidelines, the Annunciation, the Incarnation, and the insertion of Jesus in Hebrew society. So it is no surprise that the canonical scriptures tell us nothing about Joseph's birth, other than that he was from the royal line of David. His name, the Hebrew Yosef, derives from Yasaf, meaning he shall increase. The first consonant being the Y, the Greek epsilon, the Y of Yahweh in Yahweh. The name Y in Yosef might mean, may God increase. This may simply refer to Joseph's family origin, thanking God for the addition of a new child to the family. More probably, though, the name Yosef formulates a kind of prayer over the newborn child, that God may add graces to the gift of life that the child has received. With hindsight, the name already says a lot about Joseph. If we take the canonical Gospels together, it is in Matthew that Joseph appears for the first time. He is the last one in the line of succession in Matthew's Messianic genealogy, and he is presented as Joseph, the husband of Mary, of whom Jesus was born. Hereby, Matthew identifies Joseph's function in the Jesus narrative as what I have already called that of a supporting actor. It is that of assuring a genealogical link with King David for his wife's child, while Luke composes his genealogy from the perspective of Mary to affirm Jesus' biological descent from David. Matthew carefully composes his from the perspective of Joseph, who, being called to be the legal father of Jesus, guarantees his legal right to the throne of David. In Jewish law, it was not the biological, but the legal fact that really counted. Having introduced Joseph as the betrothed and the husband of Mary, Matthew steers us into the most theologically bewildering story of the infancy narratives, the action-packed and mysterious series of events that culminated in Joseph's marriage with Mary. Matthew, rooted always in Joseph's perspective, describes it sleekly and succinctly in just 2 sentences. Quote, "Now the birth of Jesus Christ took place in this way. When his mother Mary had been betrothed to Joseph, before they came together, she was found to be with child of the Holy Spirit." At this point, I think that we need Luke. We need Luke, whose principal source in this story was, of course, Mary herself. He tells us how it all came about. Luke gives us the story of the Annunciation, God's choice of Mary as the eventual mother of his Son made man. Luke informs us of Mary's inquiry as to how this was possible. Given that she did not know and apparently did not plan to know man. To know man in Semitic language means to have sexual relations with man. Finally, Luke tells us of Mary's acquiescence to God's will as a true handmaid of the Lord. Now, of course, Joseph does not feature explicitly in this narrative, but he is there. Where Mary, objecting to the angel's announcement, says, "How will this be, since I know not man?" A curious objection, indeed, because one would expect that, given that she was already betrothed to Joseph, she should have concluded that in announcing the child that she would be conceiving, the angel was referring to her first child with Joseph. But her objection, "How will this be, since I know not man?" uses the present continuous. I know not man. I am in a commitment not to know man. I am in a celibate betrothal. I am in a celibate marriage. The only possible explanation is that Mary, notwithstanding her future marriage with Joseph, did in fact not plan to have sexual relations with us. This is a choice that must have been agreed between her and Joseph together, something which is not unheard of among a category of Jews at the time of Jesus, the very pious so-called Anawim, who, notwithstanding their being married, followed a life of celibacy and absolute chastity, and defied the shame of apparent barrenness, such as that felt by Elizabeth of Ankarim, and consequently the humiliating exclusion in the eyes of other Hebrews from potentially being God's chosen parents of the promised Messiah. Something that every married Jewish couple deeply desired. Going back to Matthew, it is against this background that the account of Joseph's bewilderment upon the knowledge of Mary's pregnancy makes perfect sense. Just to remind you about the relevant text in Matthew chapter 1, 18 to 21. Well, I'm going to put it in my words. Matthew writes how Mary, the mother of Jesus, quote, was pledged to be married to Joseph, but before they came together, she was found to be with child by the Holy Spirit. Stop quote. Then the gospel continues that because Joseph, her husband, was a righteous, a just man, and did not want to expose her to public disgrace, he thought of divorcing her, of repudiating her, quietly. This text is essential for a proper and correct understanding of Joseph and his role in salvation history. At this point, I'm going to diametrically diverge from the majority opinion of biblical scholars who interpret Joseph's bewilderment as arising from a suspicion of adultery, coupled with his unwillingness to denounce Mary and put her at the risk of being stoned. This is actually none other than Apocrypha-inspired nonsense, originating from the late 2nd century Proto-Evangelium of James and the 5th century history of Joseph the carpenter. Joseph did find himself in a quandary, but not because he suspected that his betrothed had been unfaithful. He knew her. He loved her. They were most probably Anna women. They had consecrated themselves to God. The quandary he found himself in was that he was supposed, what was he supposed to do about this? His betrothed had been chosen by God to be the mother of God's own son. What is he to do about this? Should he and Mary carry on with their original plans and get married? But wouldn't this potentially interfere with God's plan for his beloved? Shouldn't he rather send her away quietly, freeing her from their common commitment to marriage, thus, in legal terms, repudiate her, so that she could freely follow God's will for her? It is this that Joseph thought of doing when Matthew tells us an angel spoke to him in his sleep. It was during this sleep that Joseph has the famous dream that made the incarnation possible. Here is how Matthew tells us about it. As Joseph considered this, that is, freed Mary quietly, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared to him in a dream, saying, Joseph, son of David, do not fear to take Mary as your wife, because that which is conceived in her is of the Holy Spirit. She will bear a son, and you shall call his name Jesus, for he will save his people from their sins. Stop quote. Joseph did indeed then have a role. His role was to bestow the name on the child that his future wife was carrying. By Jewish custom, bestowing the name was a right that belonged to the father. Thereby, Joseph was being designated by God himself as the earthly legal father of his child. Following this double annunciation of the Lord, first to Mary and then to Joseph, we have in Matthew and Luke three important infancy narratives: the nativity of Jesus at Bethlehem, the flight into Egypt, and the pilgrimage to the temple that apparently caused Mary and Joseph the fright of their lives, thinking that their 12-year-old son got lost in the Passover crowds of Jerusalem. I shall not pause on these narratives, suffice it to say that they demonstrate and illustrate the fatherhood of Joseph in the context of the family of Nazareth. Indeed, what I need to pause on is the question, should Joseph be truly considered the father of Jesus, or a father of Jesus? Well, Mary, his wife, Mary, thinks so. I have just mentioned the well-known infancy episode described in Luke chapter 2, when the adolescent Jesus accompanied his parents on the family's yearly Passover pilgrimage to Jerusalem. It was the custom then for pilgrims to make the journey in groups, women and men, keeping respectively to their gender. On their way back to Jerusalem, at the end of the first day of their journey, when the families would reunite for the night, Joseph and Mary realized that Jesus had been with neither of their respective groups. Back like a shot to Jerusalem, after a frantic search, they found their 12-year-old son at the temple. Mary rebuked him, saying, Son, why have you treated us so? Behold, your father and I have been looking for you anxiously. Your father is the way in which Mary referred to Joseph. Should one brush this off as merely a practical manner of referring to her husband when she spoke to her son? Or could it be that it was as father to her son that Mary thought of Joseph? Which begs the question, notwithstanding his not being the biological father, can Joseph be really considered father to Jesus? My short answer is yes, on various grounds. The most obvious being that Joseph was father of Jesus in the legal sense, by way of a hidden acceptance of the child as if it were his biological own. This is how Joseph's fatherhood of Jesus is mostly understood. But there is a deeper dimension to it, not often taken into account. It is that according to the Matthew narrative, and here we have to remain within the logic of the New Testament, Joseph was created earthly father of Jesus by Jesus' own real father, when through the angel, God gave him the paternal right to bestow the name on the child. Now, this again should suffice as a biblical ground to Joseph's adoptive paternity. But what about those who, unlike Catholics and maybe Bible Christians, would want a more concrete earthly validation of Joseph's role as father? It may be found in the Semitic perspective of fatherhood, which ranks what is cultural above the biological. Biologically, Joseph was not the father of Jesus, but he was for the fact that he raised him, he nurtured him, he educated him, he gave him his Davidic descent, he passed on to him his profession, and he launched him into independent adulthood. In the Semitic world, all of this was included in the significance of the term Ibn, very near to our Ibn in Maltese, Ibn, son in Hebrew. That Jesus was truly Ben Yosef, even if not biologically. Thus, Jesus was truly Ben Yosef, even if not biologically. Ben being the Hebrew word for son, and etymologically meaning constructed. The word Ben, as in Ben-Ur, for example, derives from the word bana, to build, to construct, to raise a building or a structure. Ben Yosef actually means built, something built by Joseph. In fact, in the Semitic world, more than the biological dimension, it is the formation, so to speak, dimension that defines sonship. Of course, the biological dimension is necessary for the birth of a child, and Mary, who also shared in the building of Jesus, had every right, obviously, to call Jesus Bni, that is, my son. But beyond the biological dimension, there is the cultural, and it is in this area of nurture that Joseph possesses the right to be considered a father to Jesus. The Logos needed a mother to become human life, but also a father to have Hebrew identity, together with other Jewish rights, including the possibility desired by every Jew to be acclaimed as Ben David or Messiah. To sum up, here is what the biblical Joseph is all about. It It is about being the earthly father of a son whose biological origin is exclusively ascribable to his wife. All the rest is ancillary material to support the Pauline logion, the Pauline statement that we find it in Galatians chapter 4. When the fullness of time had come, God sent forth his Son, born of woman, born under the law, to redeem those who were under the law, so that we might receive adoption as sons. Stop quote. The biography of the biblical Joseph is all about facilitating the incarnation, supporting Mary and her biological son, and, might I add, rendering possible our adoption as children of God through her Son. The biblical Joseph is indeed a man worth knowing, not only because his role at the margins of the incarnation cannot be ignored, but also because he made it possible for it to happen like it happened. His biography is very scant, indeed so scant that it incited the curiosity of those who wanted to know more about him, provoked their imagination to fill in perceived gaps in the narrative of the infancy of Jesus, and allowed for all kinds of theories to crop up, and constant attempts to harmonize a growing post-2nd century Christology with apparent biblical contradictions. Thus, a blend of curiosity, imagination, and debate that produced what have been called the Apocrypha, and in them a new, and to a very great extent fictional, image of Joseph of Nazareth. The apocryphal Joseph, the second Joseph that we are addressing today. So, alongside the biblical, the apocryphal Joseph is indeed a fascinating personage. Very familiar in liturgy, statuary, paintings, and movies, patristic writing and preaching, in nativity scenes, children's stories, Christmas plays, and Catholic devotional practices. Joseph is often portrayed as quite old, almost a grandfather, with a much younger Mary by his side. At the birth of Jesus standing in the background of the stable in Bethlehem, with eyes bursting with wonder, a balding man in his carpentry workshop, sometimes surrounded by children from a former marriage, posing with a flowering staff, and on his deathbed, accompanied by Jesus and Mary on his side. Well, the Apocrypha are the sources behind this image of Joseph. The Apocrypha are writings that appeared between the late 2nd century and the 7th century, particularly in Syria and Egypt, which, though ostensibly sacred, were considered by a majority Christian opinion as false. The reasons behind their exclusion from the canon of the New Testament are three. First, they purported to come from a secret origin, and as a consequence of this claim, they were immediately considered of dubious authenticity. Secondly, they often contradicted accepted teachings of Christ, and were thus seen as heretical. One of the teachings one finds in, for example, the Proto-Evangelium of Matthew is that in order to become a saint, a woman must become a man, because only men can become saints. So this kind of nonsense. Secondly, they often, as I said, contradicted accepted teachings of Christ, as I presented that example. Thirdly, they included too much of what one could describe as fanciful fantasy or science fiction. This does not mean, though, that everything the Apocrypha is necessarily false and to be rejected. The Catholic Church, in fact, has retained as worthy of continued inclusion in tradition, which is the earliest source of New Testament revelation, much information regarding Mary of Nazareth, such as the names of her parents, Anne and Joachim, and her avowal and her vow of virginity, symbolized by her presentation in the temple. Rejection and or retention of apocryphal information depended on there being divergence on conformity with the teachings of the canonical scripture. Well, Joseph of Nazareth features quite strongly in the Apocrypha. The New Testament Apocrypha includes many books, with 3 of them being of primary interest to us. Joseph is strongly present in the so-called Proto-Evangelium of James, which is a late 2nd century infancy gospel. He features strongly, still more strongly, in the history of Joseph the carpenter, an Egyptian 5th to 6th century document, a life, if you want, of Joseph. And in the Gospel of Pseudo-Matthew, a 7th century, another compendium, a 7th century document, that is another compendium of mostly infancy stories leading to the public life of Jesus. These 3 apocryphal manuscripts have contributed very much to beef up, mostly with fanciful imagination, the scant information afforded by the New Testament Joseph, thereby paradoxically inhibiting his cult for over 1500 years, but on the other hand, guaranteeing its grassroots growth through popular religiosity until it flourished as it did in the Catholic Church of the 19th and 20th century afterwards, and thereby sustains to this day the biblical Joseph, is the product of 3 dynamic factors which we come across over the 2nd to the 6th centuries of early Christian history. The first factor, widely acknowledged, was the desire to beef up, to fill up the information regarding the years of Jesus' infancy and young life. By the end of the 1st century, the disciples who had known Jesus in Palestine were disappearing. And the newer Christians, looking for more information about him, were frustrated. The New Testament details about Jesus' family, origin, and so-called hidden life were scant. A scantiness that left much to be curious about. Questions related to it abounded. What do we know about his mother? When was Mary born, and who were her parents? What kind of childhood did Jesus have? What kind of father was his father? How did Joseph become her husband? What did the Holy Family do while they were in Egypt? What kind of infancy did Jesus have? And so on. Another fact, so one of the reasons, one of the factors behind the apocryphal Gospels was curiosity. Another factor that troubled the post-2nd century Christians was how to reconcile such mainstream teaching as the perpetual virginity of Mary with the canonical Gospel references to the brethren, or indeed the brothers and sisters of Jesus. How could Mary be ever virgin if Jesus had brothers and sisters? I'll come to that. A third factor was a burgeoning heterodoxy. That is, a rising variety of doctrinal deviations from accepted beliefs, especially concerning the virgin birth of Jesus, his divine origins, and the truth of his humanity. One must remember that in the early centuries, there was no clearly set dogma or theology. Theology was still in flux. It was only from the 4th century onwards that one could start to speak of defined teachings and of the rejection of such teachings as heresy. Nevertheless, even as early as the 2nd century, the desire was widely felt to shield established Christian truths from deviations that clearly contradicted the substance of Christian belief, namely the divine origin of Jesus as the Son of God and the realism of the humanity that the Son of God assumed in the Incarnation. The Apocrypha were actually a populist attempt to address these issues. Within this activity, together with Mary Joseph of Nazareth, acquired a profile which hitherto he did not have. Here is what the authors of the Apocrypha say about him, and why. I cannot other than be brief here. While the canonical scriptures make no reference to Joseph's age, the apocryphal Joseph is always presented as a man advanced in years. It is the Proto-Evangelium of James that makes this claim, offering the explanation that Joseph was already an old widower when he was chosen by the high priest to become the guardian, not the husband, the guardian of the young Mary. The elderly age of Joseph, moreover, inhibited any idea of sexual desire or indeed relations from intruding into the relationship between Joseph and Mary. Moreover, the apocryphal Joseph has children of his own from a former marriage. He is a widower with children when he marries Mary. Thereby, the author of the Proto-Evangelium solves the mystery of the so-called brothers and sisters of Jesus mentioned in the canonical Gospels. They were not full brothers and sisters, but only step-siblings. The early Christian writers, with, I believe, a few exceptions, reject this explanation, saying that the Hebrew term for Joseph and for brothers and sisters always had the wider meaning of relatives. In the Semitic world, where we have tribal rather than nuclear families, all the relatives, including uncles, aunts, and cousins, as well as biological siblings, were invariably referred to as brothers and sisters. The Apocrypha supports the canonical Gospels of Matthew and Luke in the assumption that the marriage of Joseph with Mary was ordained by God. But the Apocrypha go one step further to illustrate how this happened. There are several versions of this story, the most charming being that according to the 5th century history of Joseph the carpenter, the high priest issued an invitation to 12 elderly but marriageable men of the house of David, each one representing a tribe of Israel, and asked them to respectively bring a branch and lay it upon the altar. The branch that would burst into flower, and upon which the Holy Spirit came to rest in the form of a dove, that one would be the future spouse of the Virgin when she reached the age of 14. It was the branch of Joseph of Nazareth that bloomed, and therefore he apparently never lived down, of course. Another important event in the life of Joseph of Nazareth that the books of the New Testament Apocrypha address and elaborate on, which is also mentioned in the canonical texts, was how Joseph managed the issue of Mary's unexpected pregnancy. It was the Apocrypha that introduced the interpretation that on learning of Mary's pregnancy, Joseph suspected that she had been unfaithful, an interpretation which was heftily taken up in the 16th century by Lutherans and lately also by some Catholic scholars. There are other embellishments that compose the apocryphal Joseph. He is the carpenter who makes plows, yokes, other wooden tools for cultivation, and also wooden beds. He teaches his trade to the infant son, who in turn performs bizarre miracles that ostensibly correspond to his divine origin. And he dies before the commencement of Jesus' public life and mission. This earlier death is implicitly confirmed by the canonical Gospels, who make no mention of Joseph at the Feast of Cana, which Jesus attended together with his mother and disciples. Nor is Joseph the person to whom Jesus entrusts his mother when he was on the cross, which would have been the case were Joseph still alive. And nor is it Joseph who asks Pilate for the body of Jesus to have him buried, which at that stage would by right and duty have been Joseph's role. As you see, in comparison to the biblical, the apocryphal Joseph is a much more sizable, intricate, visible, and relatable character, embodying theology, polemics, fancy, embellishment, and symbolisms. The apocryphal Joseph is a composite attempt to respond to the lacunae and to the questions arising in the biblical Joseph. The third form of Joseph, and I'll be very brief here, the contemporary Joseph. The contemporary age has fashioned its own peculiar take on Joseph of Nazareth. Believers and none among the former mostly Catholics and the very biblically obsessed evangelicals have been reinterpreting him not only in print publications but also in various forms of art, in social media and particularly movies. It is in movies, in fact, that St. Joseph has made a surprising development as a novel subject of fascination. Nevertheless, with only a few exceptions, Joseph of Nazareth mostly appears in his traditional background role in feature films on the life of Christ, as well as in movies where scenes of the Nativity of Jesus are included, as in the case of what is mentioned Ben-Hur. His role becomes more prominent and focused with the new wave of infancy narratives, as the 2006 biblical drama The Nativity Story and the 2016 The Young Messiah, where Joseph takes center stage, both American productions. Recently, and this is new, films have been made with Joseph of Nazareth himself as central character, among which the also American movie Joseph of Nazareth, The Man Closest to Christ, year 2000, billed as the first feature film of the story of Joseph of Nazareth, as well as another French feature documentary, Saint Joseph, or Un Homme du Père, which, far from presenting an apocryphal Joseph, the kind that could have sprung from the voragineous legenda aurea, attempts to answer such issues as what do we know about Saint Joseph. Contrary, I would like to conclude, but just because it's taken me too long, I would like to conclude by referring to the most important aspects of Joseph in the contemporary consideration of him. I have been wondering, for example, how to interpret this newly born interest in Joseph of Nazareth. At this point, I cannot help slipping back into theology. Theologically, this rise in interest could be interpreted as, to say it in French, to say it in English, the hour of Saint Joseph, the moment in Christian history willed by God as the time when Joseph was meant to be rediscovered and recognized, the time when his relevance would be most culturally suggestive and meaningful, the hour when he would be most spiritually needed. But this is theology, which of course cannot be discounted, and lies at the heart of the modern regeneration of interest in Joseph. How about going beyond theology, and without losing the link with the biblical figure and saint, edging towards atheism? The British contemporary philosopher Alain de Botton comes to mind, and his religion for atheists. Following the French materialist Auguste Comte, de Botton, a Jewish King's College scholar, also envisages an ideal society complete with secular versions of religion, with rituals and saints. He advocates such secular versions of sacred events as the Jewish Day of Atonement, the Catholic Mass, and veneration of saints. He would invite atheists like him, for example, to contemplate Saint Joseph in order to learn how to face the trials of the workplace with a modest and uncomplaining temper. Starting words coming from a militant atheist. I wouldn't know whether other atheists would venture that much. Certainly not fellow atheists like Richard Dawkins and the late Christopher Hitchens, who have repeatedly stated that any form of religion is none other than poison. Both of them are a far cry from de Botton, and to mention another, the existentialist French philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre, who, as Christmas was approaching one particular year, wrote with astonishing candor and depth a beautiful meditation on the Holy Trinity. Concentrating with contemplative eyes on the figure of Joseph, he wrote in French, this is my literal translation, and Joseph, what about Joseph? I couldn't paint him. I would not be able to show him as but a shadow at the back of the barn with brilliant eyes, for I wouldn't know what to say about Joseph, as Joseph would not know what to say about himself. He adores, and he is happy to adore. He feels a little in exile, I believe, and he suffers without admitting it. He suffers because he sees how the woman he loves resembles God, how already she is on the side of God. For God has come into the intimacy of his family, a fire of clarity that has separated Mary and Joseph forever. And all of Joseph's life, I imagine, would be learning to accept. Joseph does not know what to say about himself. He adores and he is happy to adore. Stop quote. What a beautiful meditation on Saint Joseph, coming from a philosopher generally considered atheist. Another shot on the contemporary Joseph of Nazareth is the devotional reconstruction of the saint. Again, while this take on Saint Joseph has as its primary source the canonical gospel, it also drinks from the Apocrypha. As in the case of the painters and sculptors, and nearer to us the filmmakers, who have made ample use of the Apocrypha, the devotional is the product of the interaction of official veneration and popular religiosity. Together, and over the last 200-300 years, the canonical and the apocryphal imagery has interacted at ground level to produce the Saint Joseph that has so much inspired the modern papacy, and particularly our Pope Francis, to dedicate this year as the year of Saint Joseph. Just skipping on to the conclusion of what I wanted to present here, I would just mention that Saint Joseph remains, of course, a problematic saint as regards ecumenism. The Christians of the Greek tradition rate him only as a minor figure in salvation history. They still accord him no independent cult. In Protestantism, it is of course the same. For the Lutherans, for example, it is much more important to say that Joseph is not Jesus' natural father than to honor him. Nevertheless, Luther finds reasons to give thanks to God for his mercy toward our Lord's guardian, to strengthen our faith by his example, and to imitate his faith and virtues. Well, we all know about the devotion to Saint Joseph in our Maltese islands. I cannot pause on this aspect, of course, of popular religiosity. I shall just refer to that in France, where numerous pilgrimages are held annually to the village of Cotignac. It's number the 21 slide. In the south of France, site of a claimed 18th century apparition of the saint to a young shepherd. I have accompanied both men and women on this annual pilgrimage, prayerfully and cheerily, walking for miles, at times through difficult terrain, towards Cotignac. And there, on arrival, I have witnessed with deep emotion young men, married men, kneeling in prayer before the image of Saint Joseph and trustfully seeking his intercession for their families and their own conversion. In conclusion, and returning to the question that I posed at the start of this paper, is Joseph of Nazareth a man worth knowing? My answer is, of course, yes. Joseph is worth knowing, if only because the gospel of Jesus is worth, if only because the gospel of Jesus is worth knowing, and worth knowing well. Joseph is worth knowing, if only because all biblical figures need to be known that compose the tapestry of Christ, and Joseph being the spouse of God's son, being the spouse of God's son's mother, and his father is no small figure in the New Testament. Both Joseph is, of course, worth knowing in order to arrive at the Jewishness of Jesus and his Jewish identity. There might be many other reasons why Joseph of Nazareth is a man worth knowing, and need I conclude here that the fact that he is resurfacing with such power after almost 2,000 years of quasi-oblivion bears out the fact. Thank you very much. I'm sorry I took so much time, so much of your time.
Thank you, Father Joseph. If somebody would like to make some questions or comments about what Father Joseph said,
Thank you
free to do that now.
Okay, thank you very much for coming, and I hope to have this published in some way. I'm very much aware that I've taken too long. I usually ask people to do not more than 40 minutes, so it's good that I'm not here for you. Thank you very much.
Father Joseph. If you don't mind, I'll just take another couple of minutes to announce the events of the coming weeks up to Christmas. On Thursday, this Thursday, we have got a talk by Father Jeffrey George Antart on Tolkien, the literary genius of our times. Okay, it's on Thursday at 7:30. Then Saturday, coming Saturday, we've got two experiences about organized by Heritage Malta at the museum here at 10 and 11. They are repeat experiences. They will be about a dive into history, 360 degrees. We've got bookings, a lot of bookings for the first one at 10 o'clock. There are some more places at the 11 o'clock one. So if you're interested, we'll speak about the Phoenician ship that has been discovered near Gozo. Okay? Then we start the Christmas concerts on Saturday the 4th. We have got a concert featuring young musicians. That is Saturday 4 December at 11:30. Saturday 11 December, always at 11:30, a Christmas concert with brass tubes. Saturday 18, the Laudato Pueri choir. Okay? Before that, on Saturday 4 December, the afternoon, we've got the opening of the exhibition of recent abstracts by James Il-Ħaġar. And on Monday, the 13th, which is a public holiday, at 11 o'clock in the morning, we've got Meet the Artist with James Il-Ħaġar, obviously. Then, on Saturday 11th, after the concert, we have got an opening of an exhibition related to the 100 years from the first procession with the child Jesus held and organized by Don George Prega. It will be the audiovisual tour of the museum. The day before, on Friday 10th at 7:30 p.m., we will have a talk explaining this procession and its historical meaning. Together with all these, we will be having a Neapolitan crib, which will be inaugurated also on the same date, 11 December, and the philatelic exhibition, which will delve into the procession and Don George Prega stamps. Okay? Thank you very much. As you always know, the museum lives off your donations. So anything you can help us with, there are the donation boxes, and we thank you for that. Thank you very much.